A woman knelt in the dust behind the county market, with 300 pounds of split, sun-blistered tomatoes heaped around her like the ruins of something, and the whole town of Dry Fork agreed she had thrown her last $6 into the dirt. They watched her load them onto a borrowed handcart, one soft red fruit after another, the skins already going slack in the September heat, and they shook their heads and went back to their own business, which was mostly the business of getting through a hard year with a little less than they'd had the year before. That is where this tale begins, though it is not where it ends, because it is easier to believe a thing is worthless than to admit you were wrong to laugh at the person who saw its worth. And by the first frost of that same year, there would be a list of names longer than her arm, all of them waiting on what those ruined tomatoes became. A year and a half earlier, in the spring of 1888, Marta Vessel had come to Dry Fork with a single trunk, a widow's black dress she had already stopped wearing, and a name nobody there knew. She was 30 years old and alone in the way that frightened the town more than any debt could, for a young woman with no husband and no father and no brother to speak for her was, in their arithmetic, a thing half-finished. She had bought the old Pearl place at the edge of the creek bottom for less than the fence wire was worth, 3 acres of clay that cracked in July and drowned in April, and a lopsided kitchen house with a good deep cellar that was the only reason she bought it at all. The men at the feed store gave her a season, maybe 2. A woman alone, they said, could not hold ground that had beaten 2 families before her. They did not say it cruelly. Cruelty would have been kinder, for cruelty at least takes a person seriously. Marta did not argue. Arguing, she had learned somewhere in the years she never spoke about, was a way of handing your strength to the person who doubted you. Instead, she rose before the light and worked her hands, rough as bark, and she watched. She watched everything. She watched which corner of the clay held water longest and which dried first, and she watched the farmers haul wagon after wagon of produce to the county market 40 minutes off, and she watched what they threw away. That was the thing nobody else looked at, the throwing away. A farmer will guard what he sells and forget entirely about what he dumps, and in that forgetting, Marta found the first thin edge of everything that came after. She had learned to cook from a grandmother in the old country, a woman who cooked the way other people prayed, and the first thing that grandmother taught her was that the sweetest sauce comes not from the perfect fruit, but from the fruit pushed to the very edge of ruin. The tomato that has hung too long and gone soft and turned all its water into sugar under a punishing sun. A firm, handsome tomato, her grandmother said, is a tomato that has not yet decided what it wants to be. "Give me the ugly ones," she used to say, "the ones the market will not take, and I will give you something the market cannot buy." Marta had carried those words across an ocean and a continent, and had never once had cause to use them, until she stood at the edge of the Dry Fork market in her second summer, the summer of 1889, and heard a fruit seller cursing his luck. The summer of 1889 had come down hard and dry. The rains that should have fallen in July did not fall, and the sun sat over the valley like a lid on a pot, and the tomatoes that would have ripened slow and sweet in a gentle year instead cooked on the vine. By the first week of September, the market was drowning in them, great split scarred fruit that no housewife would carry home and no grocer would stock, softening faster than anyone could sell them, and the growers were sick at the sight. One man in particular, a wide-sweating fellow named Coyle, who ran 3 wagons and thought himself the king of the produce trade, had a whole load going to rot in the back of his stall, 300 pounds of it and more coming, and he was ready to feed it to his hogs. Marta walked up to him with $6 folded in her palm, and she offered to take the lot. Coyle laughed at her. It was a good laugh, loud, the kind meant to be heard by the men around him so they could laugh too, and they did. $6, he said, for 300 pounds of garbage. You'd have done better to sleep in the street, missus. At least then you'd have your $6 in the morning. But he took the money, because a fool's money spends the same as a wise man's, and because it saved him the trouble of hauling the rot away. He counted the coins into his own palm and told the men around him that he'd just made $6 off a pile of nothing. And they laughed again, and Marta loaded her cart in the noise of it and pulled it away down the road without a word. Being laughed at, she had decided long ago, was a kind of privacy. Let them look at the joke. They would never think to look at the woman. She got the tomatoes home before dark, and she did not sleep that night at all. She worked in the lamplight of the kitchen house with the wide copper pot her grandmother's letters had told her exactly how to buy, and she sorted the 300 pounds by hand, one fruit at a time, cutting away the truly spoiled and keeping the rest, which was most of it. For a tomato that looks ruined and a tomato that is ruined are two different animals, and only the patient can tell them apart. She peeled and crushed and cooked them down slow over a low, even fire, adding nothing at first but salt and thyme, and as the water cooked off, the kitchen filled with a smell so deep and sweet that a stray dog came and sat at her door in the dark and would not leave. The 300 pounds boiled down and down until it was a fraction of itself, a thick, dark red, the color of garnet, and she skimmed and stirred and tasted, and near dawn she tasted again and went very still. It had worked. It was better than worked. What sat in that pot was not the thin, sour water most people boiled up and called sauce. It was the concentrated sweetness of 300 pounds of fruit that a merciless sun had done half the work of making, all its sugar pushed to the surface by the very heat that had ruined it for every other purpose. Her grandmother had been right across all those years and all that distance, the ugly ones, the ones the market would not take. Marta filled her clean jars, sealing them the careful way that kept a thing good through a winter, and she counted them, and she did the arithmetic in her head the way she always did, in the dark, quietly. $6 of fruit and a night of her own labor had become more than 4 dozen jars of something people would fight over. If only people could be made to taste it. That was the whole trick, and it was not a small one. She told no one. She banked the success in her cellar like a coal under ash, and she waited for the world to be ready to see it. She did not have to wait alone. Across the creek lived an old man named Otho Lindkvist, who had come to that valley 40 years before with nothing, and had made a hard peace with the land in a way most of the town had forgotten was even possible. He was old country the way Marta was old country, and he had watched her that whole first year with the flat, patient attention of a man reading weather. And one evening, near the end of that sauce-making week, he crossed the creek and stood at her fence and asked her, in an accent worn soft by 4 decades, what it was that smelled like his own mother's kitchen dead these 50 years. Marta gave him a spoon. He tasted it standing at the fence, and he closed his eyes, and he said nothing for a long moment. Then he opened them and looked at her with something she had not seen on a single face in Dry Fork, which was respect. The land does not care what the town says, he told her. The land only asks who is paying attention. You are paying attention. Most are not. That is the whole difference between a full cellar and an empty one. Otho became her teacher and her friend, and there was nothing else in it. No softness of the kind gossips look for, only 2 people who understood that worth is made and not given. He taught her which of the wild things along the creek could go into the pot to deepen it, and how to read the sky for the turn of a season, and how to hold her tongue at the store, which she already knew but was glad to have confirmed by a wiser head. He told her the town would come around, but slow, and only after they had first tried to convince themselves she was cheating somehow, because it is easier to believe a woman is lucky or a liar than to believe she is simply better at a thing than the men who mocked her. Watch, he said. When you are right, they will not thank you. First, they will accuse you. Then, they will need you. And only then, if you are wise, will you decide what kind of person you are going to be about it. The first person to need her was not from Dry Fork at all. A cook named Delphine Surette came out from the railroad hotel in the county seat, a sharp, precise woman who ran the kitchen that fed every traveler passing through. And she had heard from a peddler that there was a widow out, past Dry Fork, putting up a sauce that made grown men sit down in the road. Delphine did not believe peddlers as a rule, but a hotel kitchen lives or dies on what it can put in front of a stranger, and she came out on a borrowed buggy to see for herself. Marta gave her a jar and a spoon, and watched her taste it the way Otho had, the eyes closing, the stillness, and then Delphine did the thing that changed everything, which was to ask, in a businesswoman's flat voice that hid nothing, how much, and how many, and how soon. She bought the 4 dozen jars in the cellar that afternoon at a price that made Marta's careful arithmetic tremble. And she ordered as much again for every week the hotel stayed open, and she said, on her way out the door, that a thing was only worth what someone would pay for it, and that she would pay it gladly and count herself lucky. Word of that sale did not stay quiet, because money never does. When it got back to Dry Fork that the widow Vessel had sold her whole cellar to the railroad hotel for real coin, the same men who had laughed at Coyle's joke went quiet in a different way. A few came out to see the operation for themselves on the pretense of neighborliness, and stood in her yard looking at the racks of drying fruit and the great copper pot and the cellar shelves filling again, and they could not quite make their faces do what they wanted them to do. It is a strange thing to watch a man try to keep on being certain when the ground has moved under him. Coyle himself did not come. Coyle, when he heard, went very still behind his stall at the market and began, in the private ledger of his mind, to add up exactly how much a load of rotting tomatoes might be worth to a woman who knew what to do with them, and how much he had let walk away for $6. And the sum of it curdled in him and turned into something worse than embarrassment. It turned into a plan. But the plan needed time to ripen, and while it ripened, the dry summer became a killing one. The rains did not come in September either, nor the light gentle rains of October, that the whole valley depended on to soften the ground for the winter wheat. The creek that fed the bottomland dropped and dropped until it was a thread, and the wells in town went sour and low, and the corn that had looked thin in August stood dead and rattling in the fields by the middle of fall. The very sun that had cooked Coyle's tomatoes into garbage kept right on cooking, and now it was cooking the whole county, and the men who had a season or two ago pitied the widow for buying bad ground in a bad spot began to understand that there was no good ground left anywhere. Hunger changes a town. It strips the manners off it and shows you what is underneath, and what was underneath Dry Fork that fall was fear. Here is the part the town did not see coming, and the part Marta had half seen from the very start without letting herself hope for it. The clay of the old Pearl place, the cracked, worthless bottom that had beaten 2 families, held its little bit of creek water longer than any high field in the county, and Marta had spent 2 years learning exactly how to coax a crop out of it in a dry year when everyone else planted for a wet one. While the county's proud fields turned to dust, her scorned 3 acres worked the patient old country way, kept turning out fruit, ugly, sun-hardened, sugar-heavy fruit, the only kind that thrived in a season like this, and the only kind her sauce even wanted. The fortune of the whole valley had inverted in a single stroke of weather. What had made her a fool in a normal year made her the one person for 40 miles with food to spare and a way to keep it. She counted it out in the dark as she always did. She had enough, more than enough, and around her people who had laughed did not. Delphine's orders doubled, then tripled, as the railroad hotel found that its usual suppliers had nothing to sell and its travelers still had to be fed. A merchant from 2 towns over rode out to contract for jars by the gross. A grocer who had refused to stock her sauce in July now wrote her 3 letters in October, each one warmer than the last. By the 3rd week of a cold, clear November, the demand had run so far past what one woman could put up alone that Delphine, on one of her buggy trips, said the word out loud that neither of them had quite said before. A wait list, she called it, a list of the people who wanted the sauce and could not have it yet. And it was already longer than Marta's arm and growing by the day, names crowded in the margins, families and hotels, and a restaurant, clear up in the territory capital, all of them waiting on the fruit the county had thrown to the hogs. It is a strange and quiet triumph to hold a list like that. Marta held it and thought of Coyle counting his 6 coins into his palm, and she did not smile, exactly. She only folded the list and put it away and got back to work, because work was the thing she trusted and a list was only a promise. It was into this that Coyle finally made his move, though by now his move had changed shape to fit the hunger of the times. He came out to the Pearl place in a good coat, with his hat in his hands, and a smile stretched wide across his sweating face, and he called her Mrs. in a voice gone soft as butter, and he said he had come to help. He had heard of her little troubles keeping up with all her orders, a woman alone with more work than 2 men could manage, and he proposed, as a neighbor, as a friend, that he take the whole operation off her hands. He would buy the place and the cellar and the recipe together, name a fair price, let her walk away with real money in her pocket before the strain of it broke her health. He talked, and under all the honey of it was the same old sum he had run in his head all fall. The belief that a thing that had fallen into a woman's lap by luck could just as easily be lifted out of it by a man who knew business. He named a number. It was a large number to a woman who had once counted $6. It was a robbery. To a woman who now understood exactly what she had. Marta let him finish, because she had learned that people show you the most when you let them talk longest. Then she asked him one plain question. She asked how he had known her fruit was still coming in when the whole county's crop had died, since she had told no one at the market, and sold nothing there all fall. And Coyle, too pleased with himself to hear the trap in it, said that of course he knew. He'd had a man keep account of the wagons going in and out of her lane, so he'd know the size of what he was buying before he offered. And there it was, laid bare in his own words. He had not come as a neighbor who had heard of a struggling widow. He had come as a man who had watched her succeed and could not bear it, who had measured her yield in secret and meant to take it whole for the price of her supposed weakness. Otho, who had crossed the creek that morning and was standing quiet in the barn doorway, made a small sound that was almost a laugh. Marta stood up from her copper pot and wiped her hands on her apron and looked at Coyle for a long moment, and she did not raise her voice, because a raised voice is a strength handed to the person you're angry at. She told him that the place was not for sale, nor the cellar, nor the recipe, and that if he wanted to know what her fruit was worth, he need only remember that he had sold her 300 pounds of it for $6, and called himself clever, and that she had been happy to let him, She told him he had had the whole valley's answer in the back of his own wagon and had fed it to his hogs. And then, because being right is its own kind of reply, and she had no need to say more, she asked him to leave her land, and he left it, the honey gone out of his face, and something small and shamed in the set of his shoulders, and the story of his visit was around the town by nightfall, told, until the joke that had once been Marta was turned all the way around and Coyle was standing in the middle of it. That should have been the end, the clean, satisfying end, where the greedy man is shamed and the scorned woman is proven right, and it was very nearly the end. But there was one more choice left, and it was the one that mattered most, and it was the one Otho had told her would come. For the hunger in Dry Fork was real, now no joke and no lesson, and there were families that winter with cellars as empty as their pride, and a woman with a wait list, and the only surviving crop for 40 miles had every right, by the town's own hard rule, that a thing is worth what people will pay. She could have doubled her price to her own neighbors, and no court and no conscience of the marketplace would have called her wrong. Coyle, in her place, would have done it and slept well. The men who had laughed at her would have expected nothing else, for it was only what they would have done. Marta did the arithmetic one last time, alone in her kitchen in the dark, and it was a different kind of arithmetic than she had ever done before. She had come to that valley with a trunk and a widow's dress and a name nobody knew, and the town had measured her and found her wanting, and now she held the whole town's winter in her 2 rough hands. She thought about what it does to a person to be judged the way she had been judged, and she thought about the proud, frightened faces of people who had nothing left to be proud about, and she decided what kind of person she was going to be about it, which was the only decision that had ever really been hers to make. She went to Delphine and to her merchants, and she told them the far orders, the hotels and the restaurants in the capital, with money enough, would pay the full and fair price and gladly, and that was the money she would live on and grow on. But to the families of Dry Fork, the ones who had laughed and the ones who had only watched, she sold her sauce and her surplus fruit at a price a hungry family could pay, and to a few of the worst off, she did not sell it at all. She did more than that. She used the strength she had, which was knowledge, and she gathered the women of the town into her kitchen house through that hard winter, and taught them the thing her grandmother had crossed an ocean to give her, how to take the fruit the world called ruined, and make it into something the world could not do without, so that no family there would ever again be at the mercy of a wet year, or a dry one, or a man counting wagons in the dark. It is easy to be generous with what costs you nothing. It is a harder and rarer thing to be generous with the very advantage that could have made you rich, to unclench your fist around the one thing that finally made them need you. But Marta had learned the difference between what a thing costs and what it is worth, and she had decided that a town bound together was worth more to live in than a fortune held alone. One person alone against a whole town is a hard and lonely thing. One person who makes herself the center that holds a town together is something else entirely. By the following spring, the rains came back as rains do, and the fields greened up, and Dry Fork went on the way towns go on. But it was not quite the same town. Coyle sold his wagons and moved on to a place where his story was not known. The old feed store men who had given the widow a season now tipped their hats to her in the road, and meant it. And out at the old pearl place, on the cracked clay bottom that had beaten 2 families and that everyone had sworn could grow nothing worth having, there stood row after row after row of tomato plants, deliberately grown ugly and sweet, and behind them the kitchen house with its wide copper pot going day after day after day, and a cellar full of dark red jars, and a list of names by the door that never once got shorter, no matter how hard they all worked. Otho crossed the creek most evenings to sit at her fence, and one of those evenings, watching the steam rise gold in the last of the light, he said the thing again that he had said the very first time he tasted her sauce, that the land does not care what the town says. And Marta, who had come there with nothing and was scorned for it, and who now fed the very people who had scorned her and asked only a fair price and a little thanks, looked out over the fruit no one else had wanted and knew, at last, exactly what she was worth.